Let's take a look around the finished build, starting with a look at how the case mods turned out. So first of all, we have the motherboard tray mods. I replaced the front section of the motherboard tray because the original section did not allow for the installation of the ATX motherboards. It didn't have the cable routing holes, and it was just a messy panel with a lot of unnecessary holes. And so installing this panel has meant that I can properly route the 24-pin level, the SATA data and everything else, and I've also been able to install the Acro 6XT with the screen. Not that the screen is actually necessary, it's just an aesthetic feature because it's all controlled through software and it's automated, but still it's something that the customer wanted, and you can just see it through there. The power supply shroud I think was extremely important for this build. This build would have been a lot less clean without it. And you might be able to see all of the cables down there. Even though we have them all completely uniform, that is a lot of cables and a lot of mess. The problem with installing power supply shrouds is that you also have to enlarge the hole in the motherboard tray so that you can get your hands in to plug in all of the cables, because usually the cables are plugged in from around the front, but we were also able to get our hands in through this gap here. And we have a hole in the power supply shroud for all of the PCIe cables. I've also modified both of the front panels, the inner and the outer. The inner front panel needed to be modified to properly fit a 360mm radiator and fans. And the outer front panel was completely sealed up, which would have meant terrible temperatures for this build. So I've replaced the original front clear plastic section with aluminium, which I've bent to match in exactly the same shape as the plastic. And then I've opened up a nice big section, so lots of surface area here, and I've used a fine mesh. All of the panels that we use are always 1.5mm aluminium. The mesh is actually steel, but it's all painted. So the paint that I've used on this build is DNA 2K matte black. So let's take a look at the lighting. The lighting on this motherboard is obviously just amazing. I'm really impressed with it. This is the Rampage 6 Extreme, and stock of course is cycling through RGB, which looks really cool, but a lot of the colors really clash, and I prefer to just set the lighting to match the color scheme. I've decided to go for white at the front, but this is RGB, so it can be changed to anything. So I've used an Aqua Computer RGB LED strip, and it's running off the Farbwork, which is actually installed just over there. And then we have the SLR bridge, which also matches. So let's take a look at the custom cables. Now they only worked out like this because of all of the case mods that I've done. Otherwise, well, they wouldn't have worked at all. But the 24-pin is almost level. I mean, the mods allow for it to be level, but you can see that tube is pushing it up slightly. The ATX and EPS you can't even see up there, and they were incredibly difficult to plug in. I had to do it from around the back, and this is just due to how tight this case is with two 360mm radiators and all of these components. Even though this radiator is pushed all the way to the front edge, with that tube back there, and that was the only place I could run that tube, it was extremely difficult to plug in those cables. So the PCIe worked out really nicely. It runs down through the power supply shroud, and they go side by side, so it's twisted 90 degrees so that they can all run next to each other. They couldn't run the other way because stacked up like that I wouldn't have been able to fit the tubes, because you can see it's a fairly tight fit for those cables to run underneath those two tubes. But yeah, everything is nice and uniform all the way to where it plugs into the power supply. The cable combs that we have here are the new Singularity Computers billet aluminium cable combs, built on a CNC router and anodized. They are unbreakable and extremely tough. They have a lifetime warranty. We also have a cable here for the sound card 6-pin PCIe, which was a little bit unfortunate, but there was no other way to run that. So let's take a look at the loops. We have dual loops in this build. Singularity Computers Protium pump and res combos, D5s obviously. These are Protium medium 200mm reservoirs, and they were a good fit, as you can see. Everything is black polished, So we have the polished acrylic tops, black rings, we have the black and silver D5 pump cover, and we have the Protean polished acrylic D5 pump tops. These are the new Singularity Computers stop fittings with the laser etched logo. Now the tube in this build is actually also Singularity Computers. This is new. This is only the first build that I've used this in. And we found tube with just extreme clarity. And this tube is actually quite hard, but I prefer hard tube because it doesn't lose its shape when you're bending it. It takes a little longer to heat it, but still only 250 degrees for about 30 seconds. But because it's so hard, it's very difficult to make it bubble. And that's usually a big problem. Tube just bubbles so easily. And you know, once you're able to bend it, that's it. It just holds its shape perfectly. It doesn't get any flat spots or kinks. And you know, normally I'm pushing kinks out with my fingers because there's just no way to avoid them. And I usually have to do each of my tubes, well, up to 5 times. But I was able to do all of the tubes in this build the first time, just once, except for this one just here, which I had to do twice. But that's only because it's in such a tight spot, it was difficult to measure. And I do all of my tubes by hand. I don't know why, I just prefer to do it by hand without jigs. I just seem to be able to get a kind of nicer result because I can get the tube to cooperate and bend just how I like it by hand. So let's start with the GPU loop, which is a very simple loop because we've been able to go in and out of the pump top. So around the back we drop down with a 90-degree single rotary, then a 90-degree dual rotary to gain an offset to get around the power supply shroud because it didn't actually quite fit. A 25mm extension, 90-degree single, 15mm extension, another 90-degree single, a telescopic fitting, the large one, and then a 30mm extension fitting going into the radiator. And no, there is no way I could have connected hard tube down there. A lot of people look at this and think, why have you used so many fittings? Why not just use tube? Well, there's not even enough room for the tube anywhere here. You just could not bend it around these corners. Even with soft tube, you would actually have to run a big loop out and around and then come back. And you probably wouldn't get away with 1/2 inch soft tube. You'd have to use something small. Then coming out, I've used a D-plug, and then a T-fitting, and then we have the drainage system for the GPU loop, which as always is a bits power mini valve on a D-plug. Then we have another offset, 90-degree dual rotary, 90-degree single, and then into the bottom of the GPUs with 2 90-degree singles, parallel through the GPUs and then back out with a 10mm extension, a 90-degree single, and another 90-degree dual rotary for the offset. Quite a few fittings there, but that's how you get such a short, clean, high-performance loop. Obviously, the shorter the loop is, the more high performance it's going to be to a certain extent. For the monoblock loop, we come out of the pump at the back with a 90-degree single, into the first memory water block with a 90-degree single, another one coming out, then a 90-degree dual, a 25mm extension, another one and another 90-degree dual, a medium telescopic fitting, 90-degree single, a 90-degree dual to gain an offset to get down and underneath this other tube which runs back across the top, then a 90-degree dual, 25mm extension, 10mm extension, 90-degree dual, another 90-degree dual, again to get an offset, and then we have a 90-degree dual going back into the top of the res, and that is not only to get an offset, but also to get the angle that I want. This is something you can use 90-degree dual rotaries for, to get any angle between 0 and 180 degrees. And that's about it for this side of the build. Looking from around the back of the build, you can see just how important the motherboard tray case mods actually are. None of this would have worked without them. First of all, you can see one of the stock cable routing holes at the bottom here. There was another one exactly the same size just to the left of that, But I've more than tripled the size of that hole, and still you can see how tight things are. There is barely enough room for all of these cables and to get your hands in to actually plug them in. When I was plugging in this SATA power cable at the last minute, I had to get someone to stand around the other side of the build and guide me, because all of it has to be done by feel. But that cable routing hole is about as big as I was comfortable making it without starting to weaken and ruin the aesthetics of the case. It would have just become too noticeable. So you can see how much this section cleans things up back here. It gives us a nice big mounting surface for splitters, for the Aquera 6 XT, for routing cables. We also have a position down here for mounting an SSD on the ends of these screws here. Extra SATA power and SATA data there. So you can see the hole there for the SATA data, USB 3, and a few other cables. The hole for the 24 pin. And then a nice big gap at the top here for all of the extra fan cables and everything else that runs up there. And then we have the position for the Aquera 6 XT, which we were really lucky here that it just fits. You can see, I mean, the top of the 90-degree Molex just there is literally lined up with the outer panel. I really hope the rear side panel actually fits. I haven't tested that yet, but based on our measurements, it should. So not a whole lot to see back here in terms of cables, which, considering the amount of components, is usually not the case. But the core component cables, I used to really tie everything down when it came to all of the cables. But now, particularly with the core component cables, I prefer to design the cables better so that you don't have to tie them down as much. And also, with these Singularity Computers cable combs, they're very tight on the wire if you're using MDPC-X 4mm sleeve. And so, you know, once you kind of line everything up, they just clamp it there and hold it. So I haven't had to tie down the core component cables at all, any of them. That also goes for the EPS and ATX running around the side there. So this big bundle running down the middle is mostly for the FARB work. We have a big bundle that runs across the bottom and then up the side there, as you can see, for all of the fans and for the Aquera. And that's about it around the back of the build.